Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance State of the Neighborhoods webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about sort of high-level findings from the Vital Signs 2022 report, which came out back in May. As I hope many of you know, we have Baltimore Data Day tomorrow, starting at 8:15 in the morning tomorrow, and it's a full day of data presentations at the University of Baltimore. If you are not registered and you're hoping to come, please register soon. We are almost at complete capacity for the event. But this presentation is a really good opportunity to just sort of give you an update on what Vital Signs said this year. And I think it's a really great way to lead into Data Day, where we get to see providers from across the city talking about how they're using data and how they're creating data and sort of the amazing projects that are going on. So just a quick outline for where we're going to go today is I'm going to give you an introduction to BINIA. I think for many of you on the call, this might be a little old hat, but for anyone new, it's just going to be an overview of what we do, how we sort of organize information and data, and just give you a broader overall context to the Vital Signs report. Then I'm going to dive into the new indicators that we have in Vital Signs 22 and tell you a little bit what the data is showing for that. Then we're going to move into the key findings from the 2022 report and discuss that a little bit. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A. You also notice that on the first page, I sort of titled this presentation, Mind the Gap. I think a big theme that we're going to see, especially as we get into the key findings, that we're seeing a lot of gaps, maybe not necessarily in the data, but maybe in how we can interpret it. We're sort of seeing the need for maybe additional data sources or new partners or sort of on the ground confirmation one way or another. I think in some cases, this is really a product of coming out of the pandemic. The administrative state for data collection was really strained during that period of time. And we're slowly sort of rebuilding back capacity, not only to track data, but also to disseminate it and sort of make sure that it's shared widely. On the other hand, I think that there are areas of concern that we're just kind of seeing emerging at this point in time that are new, that maybe we need to sort of think through what are our systems that we can dive into a little deeper on that. So I'm hoping is that we go through the presentation today, maybe you'll have a light bulb moment and say, I know where we can get that data, or maybe this is a partner who I work with who might be a good person to sort of do a little bit of a deeper dive in this area. As I like to say, indicators point to the issue. And this is really an opportunity, I think, to dig a little deeper. So, about BINIA. We are a one-stop shop for comprehensive data, indicators, and training. We look at multiple topic areas, and we look longitudinally. So why is that important? We can look across housing, census, arts and culture, and we can look over time. So we can see how our neighborhood's changing, how have they changed, and where might they be going? Our mission as an organization is to provide accessible, reliable, and actionable data indicators about, for, and with Baltimore City and its communities. Our number one way of achieving this mission is the Vital Signs report. Every year we put out this report. This is the best way that we can provide and sort of work with communities to disseminate our data and indicators. And we are not the only organization who does this type of work. We are a part of a partnership called the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, which is located at the Urban Institute. And they are a partnership of over 30 cities where groups do very similar work to BINIA. So sometimes they might be a little more interested in health or sort of children, but realistically, what they're really interested in sort of pulling out neighborhood data to solve problems and address concerns within local communities and neighborhoods. I really like this diagram, even though I know it is a little bit wonky for folks, but I often think it's very important to sort of position BINIA within a larger ecosystem of organizations within the city of Baltimore. At our core, we are a warehouse and a repository for administrative data sets. We don't make a lot of our own data. We don't collect a lot of our own data. what we do is we take data from other sources and we normalize it to create our indicators. So we don't have a lot of flexibility in sort of how we interpret those indicators. The sort of diagram that's on the slide here sort of shows you themes that all data share. If you are organizing a data set one way or another, you're going to have an equivalence, which sort of standardizes the data. You're going to have categories. That's how you class it. And then you have phenomena. So what are the individual sort of types of data that happen within classes? And I like to say this because we don't make or control or sort of have any real bearing on how data gets classed or organized. So when it comes to us, if we're putting out an indicator, all we have in front of us is really the raw data that is given from a provider. So there are areas that we'd really like to look into, but maybe the data isn't organized in a way that would necessarily get us to the question that we're looking for. Or we could imagine a data set being categorized in a different way, but that's just not how the provider gives it. We really have to sort of operate from a mode of trust, which is to say what we get from the data provider is the most accurate and the most representative of whatever it is they're tracking. And in terms of administrative data sets, we get them from a whole bunch of sources. This includes city schools, the American Community Survey, the US Census, InfoUSA, which is a lot of our housing data. We get data from Tree Baltimore, from housing, from vital statistics. We try to bring together as many data providers as we can. Some of these data sets are public and accessible to anyone who would want to access them. And some of them we have memorandums of understanding set up that set up data sharing agreements so that we can report out for vital signs. Now, I've been using the term indicator a lot, and if you're familiar with BINYA, you probably know exactly what an indicator is. But I think it's always important to sort of clarify what is an indicator. So indicators are a measure or a set of measures that help quantify or express progress towards a goal or outcome. The other definition that I really like is that they're a knowledge technology that can be used to quantify, compare, and rank virtually any complex field of human affairs. I know that's the more academic definition, but what I really like about that, why I have two definitions on a slide, is that I like to emphasize that they're technologies, that we use them, and in many ways that we create them, that BINYA had a hand in creating these indicators. They don't just come out of the blue. And with that comes the responsibility of sort of thinking deeply about how we use them to quantify, to compare, and rank. So how do indicators get used? We see them used in a lot of capacities across Baltimore City. The most common, I think, is just kind of individual statistics. What is going on in a neighborhood in Baltimore? So we can look at crime rate at a community level, vacant houses, median household income, poverty rate. We can do a deep dive and say, how does one neighborhood kind of what's going on in one neighborhood? And are we seeing trends across data or across indicators that might tell us something? The other thing that indicators can do is sort of provide insight for the overall direction of a community. Are vacant housing notices rising or falling in a particular community? Are we seeing affordability increasing or decreasing in certain places? What about homeownership? These are questions that we can sort of look at over time and kind of point to those trends and say, is something going on here? Do we need to sort of dig deeper to sort of have an intervention one way or another? And the third bullet point is really about sort of goal setting and progress tracking. When BINYA was started in the early 2000s, this was really kind of our core mission. We were thinking about planning, and we were thinking about community level planning and how can communities set goals and then track those goals moving forward. So it was not only a way to sort of say, this is a goal that we want to work towards. Maybe we want to increase the tree canopy in our neighborhoods, but also did the strategies that we used to increase the tree canopy, did they work? And did we see that as a measurable impact over time? It also gives us the opportunity to sort of benchmark and say, how is a community doing versus the city as a whole? What about neighborhoods that it's surrounded by? How is it in the context of things? So these are all kind of the ways that we see indicators get used, both by partners in the city as well as community groups, and how we use them too as an organization. The other important thing, and you'll hear it a lot as we sort of go into the key themes from Vital Signs, is how do we measure neighborhoods? So Benia has its own custom geography. It's called a community statistical area. And this is like a grouping of census tracts. We take census tracts and we group them together. And we like to say that these approximate neighborhood conditions. The reason we look at the community statistical area at this scale is that there are just so many neighborhoods in Baltimore. And neighborhoods can vary really greatly in terms of size, particularly in size of population. So when we were getting started as an organization, there was really this question as well, how do you make communities comparable to one another? And the community statistical area is kind of a meso or a middle level unit that lets us say compare based on population. It creates an equivalence across our communities in the city of Baltimore. So some people might feel like, I don't really feel like my neighborhood should be a part of one CSA versus another. And I happy to talk to that at another time. But realistically, this has been a really good way to sort of understand community change over time and to sort of dive into what's really happening on community to community. And we do projects sometimes that are at that neighborhood scale, that kind of smaller look, but it then means that we can't really compare to others. We can't really understand sort of what's going on in comparison to the city, just because the units of analysis are so small. All right, so Vital Signs. Vital Signs is our annual report that we put out each year. It's made possible with generous support from both the Annie E. Casey Foundation as well as the T. Rowe Price Foundation. Every year we update the data, and the data is lagging. So for this year, we updated through 2022. Next year, we'll update through 2023. When we do an update, we put out a report on our website. We update our interactive website and open data portals, and we add maps. So it's a sort of comprehensive update that can give you the tools that you need to sort of look at the indicators for 2022. We look at 8 topic areas. Those are census and demographics, housing and community development, children and family health and well-being, crime and safety, workforce and economic development, arts and culture, education and youth, and sustainability. Also want to say that the children and family health chapter has not been updated since prior to the pandemic. It's an area that we've really struggled with our data providers to get updates on the data on. So you'll notice if you are clicking through our website that those indicators are going to be out of date. We continue to try to work hard to address this, but our hands are a bit tied in terms of actually getting that data. So moving on to what's new for this year. And new indicators are always really exciting because they add to our repository of data and they give us new insights to what's going on the ground. So the first new indicator we have this year is the percent of the population working from home. So since the pivot to work from home and virtual learning at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been real questions about sort of what's the long-term impact of this shift on commuting patterns, office occupancy, and the future of work. So the ACS, which is the American Community Survey, they ask respondents about their commuting habits through the question, how did this person usually get to work last week? Worked from home is one of the options that can be selected in the survey. So given how this question is framed, this indicator primarily tracks those who work from home, but it's not really going to capture workers with hybrid schedules. Just wanted to add that in. But what we are beginning to see is some emerging patterns about where are people working from home? Where are they concentrated? So we used the 5-year ACS estimates from 2018 to 2022. And overall, in the city of Baltimore, 13.8.4% of residents work from home. This indicator ranges from a high in North Baltimore, Guilford, and Homeland, and which is just where my cursor is right there, and a low of 1.1% in Southeastern, which is down here. So that is a new indicator that we're really looking forward to tracking over time and sort of seeing what does the data say moving forward. I think actually 2 years from now will be the most interesting once we get the 2022, what'll that be, 2024, 2025 ACS data. That's when we'll really get the full kind of pandemic responses, and we'll be able to see if there's any change or movement that way. Our second new and returning indicator is rate of evictions. This is actually a returning one, but we had not been able to access eviction court records for quite some time. But thanks to a new law enacted in 2022, Maryland is requiring the District Court of Maryland to collect and report on eviction case data. I don't think Claudia Wilson Randall is on this call, but she was instrumental in making this bill happen, and we are so grateful to have this data. So thank you, Claudia. But this is an interesting data set in that we don't actually have it for 2022. So this is 2023 data, but we do have it up on our website. We did want to push it out. We think it's important to sort of dive into this data. And one thing that really surprised BNEA staff as we were looking at this indicator is that surprisingly, communities with the highest rental affordability index, so those with the highest percentage of people paying above 30% of their annual median income on rent, do not have the highest rates of eviction. I think we sort of thought we would say, those who are paying more of their incomes on rent, we might see higher evictions, but that just doesn't seem to be the case. So based on this data, the CSAs with the highest rates of eviction per 1,000 residents were Dickeyville and Franklintown, and that was 37.3% over on the west side. Downtown Seton Hill with 25.8%, Cherry Hill at 21.5%, and Southwest Baltimore at 21.2%. The CSAs with the lowest rates, all of these in the 1 to 2%, were North Baltimore, Guilford and Homeland, South Baltimore, and the Inner Harbor and Federal Hill. So our next and last new indicator is the rate of reported car crashes per 1,000 residents. The state of Maryland recently made the reports submitted to the Maryland Department of State Policies through the automated crash reporting system available for download. So this is a system that state police go into, city police step into, access any sort of, there's a lot of policing units in the state, all of them report to ACRS. So they've made this data public, and we've been able to access years 2019 through 2023 at this point. And these describe crashes with injuries, death, and property damage. In general, this indicator sort of follows what we saw with our previous best match for understanding where car accidents happen, which was 911 calls, which is that we see a higher rate of crashes reported where we have a lot of density, like downtown, and where we have overlap with our highways, so 95 or 395. So the highest rates are really Pigtown, Downtown, Southeastern, and Greektown Bayview. We are going to go back into talking about the 911 reports in a minute, and one of our motivations for sort of finding a new data source was some things we're seeing in the 911 call data. So just keep this in mind as we move forward. All right, so we're on to key themes for this year. These are sort of the big picture items that we saw across the data. It's not going to be a comprehensive sort of drink from the fire hose. This is what our indicators say. We tried to be a bit more specific. if you have any questions about the vital signs report or any of our indicators, please don't hesitate to reach out to us and our staffs. This is going to be a pretty high level overview. So something that you may or may not know is that children under 5 were undercounted in the 2020 census. This was a nationwide undercount of 5.46%. So for Baltimore City, the rate of children being undercounted is actually 10.9%. And just for some context on that, only 150 counties out of a little greater than 3,000 in the United States had a higher undercount. This makes sense. The children are normally undercounted in the census, particularly in that 0 to 5 range. And the pandemic was an incredibly difficult time, I think, to specifically get that population. But within the context of that, BNEW tracks the percentage of the population under 5 years of age using ACS 5-year estimates. The ACS age estimates, while based on the census count, are slightly different. They're an estimate based on population. And the margins of error for this indicator are really quite high, to the point where we weren't really sure about whether we should put out some of these numbers, because the margin of error can be, it would change sort of the quintiles that we have there if we reported on it. So we sort of looked at children under 5 this year and said, some really weird stuff is going on in these ACS 5-year estimates. So I'm just going to explain what's going on and then point to some of the contextual things that might be shaping this data one way or another. So in 2018-2022, the top 3 communities with the lowest percentage of the population were Midtown, Greater Lauraville, and Pigtown Carroll Park. Now, historically, Midtown has had low rates of this of 0 to 5 population, but in Greater Lauraville, this rate was 5.8% in 2013 to 2017. And during the same period in Pigtown Carroll Park, the rate was 7.4. So for Lauraville and for Pigtown, these are really big declines in the population under 5 years old, something that we would be somewhat concerned about. There are other CSAs that saw large declines in this measure between non-overlapping ACS estimates, and that includes Mount Washington, Cold Spring, so negative 6.7%, Southwest Baltimore of negative 5.3%, and Edmondson Village of negative 4%. So we're seeing declines in children under 5 years old within particular neighborhoods, and we're a bit concerned. So what's going on nationally? We know that fertility rates are declining overall in the US, and these declines are noteworthy as the rate of children, and this is noteworthy because these declines in the rate of children under the age of 5 have kind of stayed stable in the past decade in most communities in Baltimore. So there's a few things that could be going on. One, this could just be a margin of error. We are making a mountain out of a molehill on this. And with vital signs, there can, at the sort of scale that we're looking at, we could just be looking at it too small to really understand the picture on the ground. And there could also be, there's some thing going on between the margins of error and fertility rates are declining, and it's just kind of making the sort of overall picture seem a little worse than it is. And a third possibility is that communities where we might expect there to be kind of a consistent rate of children in this age group are actually declining. And this is what we kind of think demands further explanation. So typically what BNEW would do is we would pull from the Maryland Department of Vital Statistics to dig a bit deeper into this. And this could give us the rate of children that were born within CSAs each year. We have actually not been able to access this data at the CSA level since 2019. So we're flying a bit in the dark that way. But we really do think that this is important to flag and to dig deeper on and to sort of say, we might be seeing declines in neighborhoods that typically had sort of consistent rates of children in this area. Again, we're going to continue to try to get the data we need to confirm or not confirm this, but this was really, I think, our most pressing theme this year. So key theme number 2, we look at a data set from the Department of Transportation that looks at event permits citywide. And this is really the favorite indicator of many folks I talk to. They love this indicator. And I love this indicator too, because it shows you what's going on the ground. It tracks everything from block parties to marathons to festivals. And we're able to really see what's going on in the community. How are people organizing? And what we saw in 2020 was that there was a decline in the event permits. Event permits got really low because people weren't gathering in person. But we started to see a slow but sustained recovery of this indicator. Given the importance of community events, particularly how local events may support the rebuilding of community, we decided to take a closer look of what types of activities were returning to Baltimore City and in what neighborhoods. So when we look at block party permits specifically, that's a subset within the data set, something really interesting emerged. So in 2018, there were 229 permits issued for block parties in Baltimore City. We thought 2018 was a good year to kind of look at. 2 years before the pandemic, stasis, kind of normal moment. That's kind of our baseline here. In 2022, there were 99 permits issued for the same type of an event, a decline of 43% citywide for block party permits. All but 6 CSAs citywide lost at least one block party during that period. But most strikingly, we have this cluster of 4 CSAs in West Baltimore that lost more than 8 block parties. Also, if you count in sort of Greater Mondawmin and Poppleton, which lost from 5 to 8, the cluster gets a little bigger. So from our vantage point, there's a clear distributional pattern going on in the decline of permits issued for block parties. And we think there's a need to kind of dig into what's actually going on here. Are neighborhoods within the CSAs in West Baltimore actually organizing fewer block parties, or are they not getting permits in order to throw block parties? And is there some sort of barrier that they are facing to being able to put on these events? So there's a few ways that we could look at this. One way would be to analyze the number of permits for block parties denied during this period and the reasons for denial. And another avenue would be to talk to community leaders from these neighborhoods to really understand the impact of these changes. Regardless of approach, we really think that this is an area that demands further investigation, and given the sort of clear distributional dimensions of this particular trend. So key theme 3, we use 911 calls to kind of measure how are people reporting crime. So 911 calls don't exactly tell you where crime is happening, but they're a good indicator of trust in the systems that people are using to report crime. So something very interesting occurred in the 2022 data, which is that 3 of the 4 indicators that BINYA uses that come from 911 calls saw a declining rate of 10 points or more. So we track narcotics, auto accidents, common assaults, and shootings. So we look for 911 calls related to those type of emergency events. So for narcotics, auto accidents, and common assaults, all of them saw a decline of 10 or more points between 2021 and 2022. Now, what's really interesting about this is that we see this sort of similar curve for all of the 911 calls, which is you have this decline in 2020. Again, people were not on the streets. Crime declined significantly during 2020. You see this rise again in 2021. And then in 2022, you see this decline for narcotics, auto accidents, and common assaults. We also saw a decline in shootings, but it was very much in range to previous years. So we don't think that shootings necessarily follows this trend. So it's puzzling because crime rates in 2022 did not fall in the way that they did in 2020. And yet nearly all of these indicators are at or below their 2020 rate. So we've long noted the kind of limits of 911 data for our indicator definitions. Multiple calls can be made for a single event and may not necessarily report every event. And rates of calls don't actually measure crimes. They measure the rates of how the public reports crimes. But yet, we've been reporting these indicators, and they're a really good mechanism to contextualize the reported Part 1 crime data. And normally they kind of match. So we're not really sure what's going on in sort of this decline in 911 calls. Is there sort of a general distrust and sort of people aren't using the system? Are calls maybe being diverted? On the auto accident side of things, we think that this partly might be due to the emergence of speed cameras. The ones on I-83 were installed in March of 2022. And there's also been north and south, and we did see some declines in CSAs where those sort of crashes would have been counted. And there have also been numerous other speed cameras put in 2022 that might have sort of influenced the automobile one. But we're not really sure how this relates to either narcotics or common assaults. So again, it's another gap. It's another question we have, but we think it's something worth highlighting given what we're seeing trend-wise. And then finally, another key theme, and one I know everyone likes to dive a little bit deeper into, is housing. What's going on in housing? So we know that the market went a little kooky in 2020 and 2021 with low interest rates, and then things sort of settled a bit in 2022. And so one of the things that we're seeing overall, and we're getting a lot of questions about, is what's going on with renters in the city of Baltimore. We know that there's a housing shortage nationwide. We know that the growing costs of rents are putting pressure on people within the city of Baltimore. So wanted to pull out the affordability index for rent. Again, this is the percentage of renters in a given community paying more than 30% of their household income on rent. So it actually declined slightly between 2013 and 2017 and 2018 and 2022 from 49.8% to 49.1%. Not a huge decline, but it is a bit of a decline. But there's some communities that have seen really, really large increases in unaffordability between these two time periods. Specifically, Beachfield, 10 Hills, and West Hills. They saw an increase of 23% in the percentage of households paying more on their rent. What makes this, I think, particularly something that we really want to flag is that the owner occupancy rate in this neighborhood is really high. It's 75%. It's one of our highest in the cities. So renters in that neighborhood are disproportionately experiencing unaffordability there. And we also saw other communities in the city with quite substantial rises in rental unaffordability, which were Pigtown, Carroll Park, Southeastern, and Mount Washington, Cold Spring. So I think this is one of those indicators where on the face of it, citywide, things, might look like they're trending in the right direction, but we're seeing certain communities with really big spikes in unaffordability for renters. And I think it's just something to watch moving forward. And this, I think, is a bright spot, and that's why I'm going to be ending the presentation on it, which is for as long as we have tracked the rate of the percentage of residential properties with rehabilitation permits in Baltimore, this is the highest it's been in the past decade. So 5.4% of residential properties got rehab permits that exceeded $5,000. This is great news. It means that people are investing in their property. More substantial we're not just seeing this in areas with high vacancy rates. Typically, this has been a good way for us to measure kind of vacant building renovations because it's a higher dollar amount going into a property. And so we've seen it in areas with high vacancies. But this year, our highest one was South Baltimore, which was a surprise and kind of came out of nowhere. So for me anyway, this suggests that both deferred long-term maintenance is happening in neighborhoods that are experiencing high vacancy rate, and also is happening in communities that consistently have strong housing markets. People are investing in their properties. Maybe it's because high interest rates are making it hard for them to sell, and they're thinking about kind of sticking around for a while. But I think it's a good sign that we're seeing this much activity and sort of seeing this percentage increasing. One thing I do want to, just give a bit of context for is we're not looking at inflation here. We do know that inflation has affected construction costs quite significantly since the beginning of the pandemic. So one of the things we're thinking about looking into a little further is just trying to understand whether the average or the median of construction costs related to permits has risen over time, which would just be a way for us to contextualize these numbers a little bit. So overall, we think this is good, but do want to just say that inflation might also be a factor in this as well. So with that said, and with time, I'd like to open up the floor for questions from anyone. I believe you can all unmute yourself. So if there are any here or in the chat, I'm happy to answer them. No questions?
Okay, I'll add some questions here. Thanks for the great presentation. So one of the things I'm curious about is, for some of this new statewide data, where it is that the vital signs can be placed in the context of statewide data. So if you have 1,000 residents, like what's the number for Baltimore City, or percentage of Baltimore City as a part of the whole state? So how do we kind of measure among communities in Baltimore, but also measure what's going on other places? Are we, an outlier, which I suspect we are for some of these, or are we doing better than the state, quote unquote?
It's a good question. And I think that there have been some BNIA projects in the past few years that have really tried to give that statewide perspective. The two I can kind of think off the top of my head are the Digital Equity Index that we work with Abel and John Horgan on, and the sort of the housing voucher work that Cheryl really took a lead on. So I guess I can speak a bit to the digital equity one, even though I was not here. That one, we made a statewide index that was at the zip code level. So zip codes as a geography, they're not ones BNIA uses a lot, primarily because they can erase a lot of differences across geographies. But that zip code analysis was able to sort of pinpoint strategic areas, both in the city and statewide, that were lacking within different measures of digital access and digital equity. Something that we have done now moving forward, now that that map has been circulated and that tool has sort of been used to inform policy, is to actually look at it at the census tract level. So look at it at what's going on the ground within that index. What we saw there, and when we looked at updated data, is that the city benchmarks below the state pretty much across the map on digital equity. The way that that index is calculated makes it so that there are parts of the state of Maryland that rate so high on the index, and those ranges, that sort of upper quintile, don't exist anywhere in Baltimore City at all. So actually, when we benchmark to the state, we tend to look a little worse in that metric. And then if we just sort of benchmark within Baltimore City, some communities might look a little better on a scale than if we were also comparing to the state. So I think in many ways, when we look at the state, at state level data, we see a really big disparity. And I actually think that that's worth highlighting a lot. We, Bina included, get really in the weeds on the disparities that are going on within Baltimore City. And those disparities are very, very real. But when you look at a statewide level, man, they're even worse. And it sort of reveals this long history of, systemic disinvestment from the city that I think is often overshadowed by the sort of smaller ones between community to community.
Thanks for
Cheryl,
that. I just want to mention full disclosure, Able provided funding
yes.
for that project. So I love the way you just described the whole product from that.
And then Cheryl, do you want to sort of jump in and say something about the map that you did on voucher usage? Because I think that one was done at a census tract level and got us to some different conclusions. So I think this might be a good place to kind of showcase that.
Sure. So, Bina worked on a project. We partnered with, let me see if I can get my acronyms right, MEDCEP, so Maryland Center for Economic. I can never remember if it's policy or progress, but MEDCEP. And we looked at some census tract data to get an overall picture of the relationship between housing voucher utilization at the census tract level and rental affordability for the Baltimore metro area. So we looked at obviously Baltimore City and then all of these surrounding counties. This was an effort for us to start filling in some of those gaps that Amanda was talking about in our knowledge, because oftentimes when you're looking at these maps, it's like, okay, we can see these patterns going on within the city, but we know that, boundaries, these are social political constructs, and the world doesn't fall off once we leave Baltimore city limits. And so we were able to see some really interesting patterns of data kind of extending outside of Baltimore City and into Baltimore County, specifically thinking through, what are neighborhoods where folks that are renting are really struggling to be able to afford to pay their rent and other housing costs. And so that was an interesting project where ultimately we created a map and a dashboard to understand not only the spatial components and the variations, but we had some fun sliders, fun for me in designing it, but some sliders that enabled us to also do some filtering of the data and see how the data relates to race and ethnicity and to a few other different factors that describe social demographics. But kind of getting back to this point, though, about gaps in data and, just really hammering home some of these points that Amanda has been making today, is just that in order for us to do a lot of these analyses at the metro area or even the state level, we need to ensure that we're making apples to apples comparisons of the data sets. So obviously we know how to calculate measures, but if just different jurisdictions might be collecting the data in different ways, might not be collecting the same variables, that introduces bias. And we want to make sure that if folks are going to be looking at this information, that any of these comparisons, these contextualizations are really being made properly. So that's where data sets, especially from the US Census Bureau, so the American Community Survey, LEHD, which is the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics data set, these are national data sets. These enable us to look beyond Baltimore City's borders and have greater understandings. There are some data sets that are now being made available from the state of Maryland. I'm on the Maryland Council for Open Data, so it's been really an interesting process over the last few years in thinking about what resources the state can make. But so it's not just about the data sets and ensuring comparability in terms of attributes of, what is specifically collected, but also that spatial component here. We are experts on geographic mapping. And again, we would want to make sure that we're able to synthesize information in a way that is, understandable and, very specific as well. So while it's phenomenal to be able to understand some of these larger contexts of how does Baltimore fit into, how do neighborhoods fit in within Baltimore? How does Baltimore fit in within around the state? But we're always going to be curious of, what are some of these instances and thinking about data at different scales so that we can really understand the nuances that exist in these data sets. Because ultimately, the reason why Beanie exists, the reason why we get out of bed every day is to think about how can this data and information be used for people on the ground? How do we make it actionable for folks? So we've done a couple of these projects. We're always looking for these new opportunities to think through ways that we can start measuring different data sets, create indicators, but ultimately we want to make sure, and this is one of our responsibilities, that we have responsible and educated use of information.
Thanks, Cheryl. Are there any other questions before we wrap up for today? All right. Then with that being said, I know you all are just quiet because you're just trying to save your energy for day to day tomorrow, and you want to make sure you have the best questions for that. So I'm hoping to see many of you in person tomorrow morning, bright and early, or throughout the day. But thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. And if there are any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to myself, Cheryl, or anyone on the Benia staff. So talk soon, and thank you again for joining us.